episode of our series on the Eucharist, commenting on St. Thomas Aquinas. And in fact, it's the last episode commenting on Aquinas' treatise on the Eucharist. I'll probably have one more right after this to sort of tie things in a bow, but this will be the last one on the content from Aquinas in the Summa about the Eucharist. It's been a sweet ride, so let's dive in. Okay, we're continuing to talk about the rite of the sacrament, and we are going to talk about that. That's an intelligent sentence. Okay, so the first one is this very long article about whether the words spoken in this sacrament are properly framed. This is a really long article, basically because he's just using this as an opportunity to talk about the structure of the Mass and how the Mass flows and how the Mass logically moves from one part to the next part to the next part and finds its culmination at the end. Because I did literally an entire year of episodes every week talking exactly about this, I'm basically going to slide over this question, but no ifs and buts. That's just what I'm going to do. Okay, the next one. How about that? The next one is whether the actions performed in celebrating this sacrament are becoming. Okay, again, this is an article that Aquinas uses to basically talk about what the actions mean that we do during the Mass. And again, this is a really long article. The last 3 articles are super long. It's almost like Aquinas was thinking to himself, he's like, oh shoot, this is the last question I'm going to have on the Summa, so I have to fit everything in. And it's like, all right, man, cool. So he has 12 objections here. It's like he's never had 12 objections before. It's like, so where are all of these coming from? Okay, anyways, all of these objections are just like, there are different physical gestures or things that we use during the Mass. Let's talk about them. So for example, he says, well, what about washing hands? What about that gesture? And he says, the washing of hands is done in the celebration of the Mass out of reverence for this sacrament, and this for 2 reasons. First, because we are not wont to handle precious objects except the hands be washed. Isn't that a really pretty way of saying, if you're gonna touch something really precious, wash your hands? It's just like, it's a prettier way of saying that. Okay. And then the second one is on account of its signification. The washing of hands, the washing of the extremities of the limbs denotes cleansing from even the smallest sins, right? The washing of the extremities denotes interior cleansing, right? That's a pretty sacramental kind of vision, right? Interestingly, he asks a question about the incense. Why do we use incense? We use incense not as commanded by a ceremonial precept of the law, but as prescribed by the Church. Accordingly, we do not use it in the same fashion as it was ordered under the old law. It has reference to 2 things. First, to the reverence due the sacrament. You're getting a theme, right? A lot of reverence. Why? Because it's really Jesus who's there in the sacrament. Out of reverence due to this sacrament. That is, in order, by its good odor, to remove any disagreeable smell that may be about the place. Okay, makes sense. And second, it serves to show the effect of grace, wherewith Christ was filled as with a good odor, according to Genesis 27. Behold, the odor of my Son is like the odor of a ripe field, and from Christ it spreads to the faithful by the work of his ministers. According to 2 Corinthians 2, he manifests the odor of his knowledge by us in every place. And therefore, when the altar which represents Christ has been incensed on every side, then all are incensed in their proper order. Probably you're like, hey, odor is almost always used in a negative sense. It's like, well, right now it has a positive connotation. So that's just how that goes. And you might also think like, hey, I thought incense was about the prayers rising up to God, being pleasing to God, and giving a good odor as a kind of representation of the pleasingness of our prayers to God. Yeah, that's totally true. That is one beautiful and true way of thinking about incense. It's also cool to think about incense as a symbol for grace, as Aquinas just did, where he's incensing the altar, which represents Christ, and then that incense overflows to the people as the people are incensed right after the incensing of the altar, like the grace of Christ flowing out from Christ to the people. So that's pretty cool too. And they're not mutually exclusive. Okay, let's look at one more. Again, there are 12, so kind of sparing you a little bit. Okay, the breaking of the host. Why do we do that? He's like, doesn't the breaking of the host, wouldn't that imply being severed from Christ? That's the objection. And he responds, no, the breaking of the host denotes three things. First, the rending of Christ's body, which took place in the Passion. Second, the distinction of his mystical body according to its various states. And third, the distribution of the graces which flow from Christ's Passion. It's like, wow, I didn't know that's in this movement, right? The fracturing of the host, all of those ideas, all of those symbolism, all of those truths are being symbolically expressed in the Mass. Pretty cool. Okay, last article of the last question on the Summa. Well, on the treatise of the Eucharist in the Summa. You get it. Okay, Article 6. Whether the defects occurring during the celebration of this sacrament can be sufficiently met by observing the Church's statutes. What is that question? Well, it's basically, what does the priest do, or what are we supposed to do when things go wrong? That's basically what this question is. So the first thing that Aquinas treats is, what if the priest be stricken by death or grave sickness during Mass? It's like, whoa, what happens then? If the priest be stricken by death or grave sickness before the consecration of our Lord's body and blood, before the consecration, then Aquinas says, these are all Aquinas' opinions, by the way. So these are kind of less magisterial in this section. Before the consecration of our Lord's body, so if the priest dies before the consecration of our Lord's body and blood, then he says there's no need for it to be completed by another because the consecration hasn't happened yet. But if the death or the severe sickness, the stroke, for example, if that happens after the consecration has begun, for instance, when the body has been consecrated and before the consecration of the blood, or even after both have been consecrated, then the celebration of the Mass ought to be finished by someone else. And he lays down a reference to a previous norm from something called the Decretals. Okay, that's interesting. Let's see what else. Again, you might not be surprised to learn that this is a long article. Here's another really interesting one. If a fly or a spider falls into the chalice before consecration, or if the chalice be discovered, or if it be discovered that the wine in the chalice is poisoned. It's like, okay, so what happens? So if there's a fly or a spider in the chalice before consecration, or if it's discovered that before consecration that the wine is poisoned, Aquinas' solution is pretty straightforward. You should pour it out, and after purifying the chalice, fresh wine should be served for consecration, right? So that's before consecration. But if anything of the sort happens after the consecration, this is Aquinas' instruction, the insect should be caught carefully and washed thoroughly and then burned, and the ashes and the ablution together with the ashes thrown into the sacrarium. Interesting. Even more interestingly, this, I don't actually know what I think of this, but I guess I can't really think of a better solution. He says, if it be discovered that the wine has been poisoned, and then the priest consecrates that wine, the priest should neither receive it nor administer it to others on any account, lest the life-giving chalice become one of death. But, because it's been consecrated, it ought to be kept in a suitable vessel with the relics, and in order that the sacrament may not remain incomplete, he ought to put other wine into the chalice, resume the Mass from the consecration of the blood, and complete the sacrifice. This is like really fascinating to me. It's like, I have never thought of that before, ever. And anyways, yeah, like he has another section. He's like, well, what if the priest forgets to say something? And if the priest forgets to say something necessary, well then Aquinas says, but if he is certain that he has left out any of those words that are necessary for the sacrament, namely the form of consecration, it seems that the same thing ought to be done as was stated above with regard to the defect in the matter, namely that he should begin again with the form of consecration and repeat the other things in order, lest the order of sacrifice be altered. So this one's actually maybe not as crazy or unlikely. It's kind of like the priest is saying Mass and then maybe he skips a line, and it's like right during consecration. And then he's thinking about it. He's like, shoot, did I just skip something? It's like, well, just go back and say it again. That's basically the norm that Aquinas is giving there. And that's where we're going to conclude. So hopefully this has been helpful for you and enjoyable. Like I said, I think last time I'll think of something interesting to say as a kind of concluding episode, and we'll wrap up there. So, but regardless, it's been really great for me, hopefully for you, presumably for you if you're watching this, to walk through the Summa, the Aquinas' treatise on the Eucharist in the Summa, because again, it's a kind of reservoir of extraordinary beauty and truth on the great gift that Jesus has given to you and I in the most blessed sacrament. So with that, adieu.